So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and in this video I'm actually going to be showing you how to diagnose a bad alternator. I'm going to show you what happened with my alternator on my 2001 Ford Powerstroke 7.3 liter and the replacement of it as well. So let's get to it. So on our way back from a dune trip pulling the toy hauler, our battery light on our truck started flickering on and off intermittently. However, the voltage gauge was not doing the same. So we did make it home without a problem, and we're going to go over some things you can check to see if you've got a bad alternator. So right here I've got a voltmeter. Now this is a pretty high dollar voltmeter, however a $10 special at Harbor Freight will do the same thing for you. I've got it set to DC volts, and I've got the black lead on the negative, and then we're going to put the red lead on the positive and see what our voltage is. You should be ranging anywhere from 12.3 to 12.7 volts. So I was reading 12.45, so that's good. Another thing, if you've got a diesel, you want to make sure that you get the same reading on both batteries. If you just have a gas car with one battery, you only need to check the one. Now I'm going to start the truck and we're going to check it while it's running. Your battery voltage should increase. So right now my truck is reading 13.86, which is good. You want to see anything above 13, no higher than 14.5. If you're charging above 14.5, the regulator is bad in your alternator and you can start causing all kinds of problems. For curiosity purposes, since I was driving when I noticed this issue, I went ahead and revved my truck up to about 2,000 RPMs to see if I was getting any different reading. It continued to read the same voltage as expected, because the bumps in the road were causing a bad connection intermittently. Now I have seen some alternators that are centrifugally excited, which means you do have to rev them up once to get them to start charging. However, in this day and age, that is highly unlikely. Another thing you want to check is to make sure that the back of your alternator on the main power lead is reading the same voltage as your batteries. So in my case, my batteries and the back of the alternator were all reading between 12.64 and 12.66, so we're good. If you don't get readings that are close to each other, you could have a bad ground or a bad cable. Another thing you can check is to make sure your alternator has the exciter power to make it start charging. It's going to be one of the small wires on the pigtail. In my case, it was the yellow wire, and the truck had to be running to get this voltage, but I am getting 14 volts to that. Therefore, the alternator is getting excited. And then I went ahead and checked my battery voltage behind the alternator on the main power cable and both batteries. Now, with the engine running, I did have like a 0.20 voltage drop, but that's because the alternator is producing the power and the batteries are accepting it. So a little bit of a voltage drop from there to there while the engine is running is expected. Now we're going to show you what happened with my alternator.
So we're going to test the big cable up. That is super hot, so we have a bad connection right there.
So in this situation, the bumps in the road were making that make contact and then not make contact, which is why my battery light was coming on intermittently. As soon as I touched that, I knew I had a loose connection, because when you have a loose connection, it creates resistance, which creates heat. I didn't see that sparking at first. I felt this, it was super hot. That told me we had a problem right there. So now we're going to go ahead and change out this alternator. It is a very easy thing to do. So I'm just disconnecting the ground on each battery. Now I'm just disconnecting that main power lead that was loose, and it ended up breaking because of the heat. Now there's one pigtail on the back of this alternator, and you do have to be careful with these plastic pigtails. You'll notice I've got butt connectors on mine because it already broke on me once. You have to push that tab in very carefully and then pull as you do it. I actually used my screwdriver to leverage it up a little bit. Now we're going to take the belt off. This is a picture of the tensioner because I couldn't really give you a good view on my truck. You're going to need a 1/2-inch ratchet to loosen the belt. Then on the other side of the tensioner there's a clip, and if you hold the tensioner loose and push that clip with your finger, it will hold the tensioner. This might not be on the tensioner if you got an aftermarket one already. Make sure you have a belt diagram for your engine, or take a couple pictures of the routing, because serpentine belts can be a little on the complicated side. So I've got my ratchet on the tensioner, and it's about halfway down on the passenger side of the engine. We're going to loosen that up and pull it off one of the pulleys. Now we're going to remove the 3 bolts holding the alternator. And that's how simple it is to remove the alternator off the engine. So I'd actually done this alternator about 3 or 4 years ago through Napa, and they carry a lifetime warranty if you keep the receipt. So I ended up getting this alternator for free. So the one pigtail and the main power connection were in different locations on this alternator. However, it was just an updated design. So we're just putting the bolts back in here and starting them by hand. Then using my impact, I snugged them down to the base and then went around them one more time to make sure they were tight. Now keep in mind, I'm used to what my impact will do, because you can snap these bolts using this big of a gun. Plus my rigid gun also has an automatic setting that will stop after it torques a certain amount, unless you hit it again. So one other good thing to do at this point, since the belt is off, is spin all your pulleys, including your water pump, idler pulleys, etc., to make sure you don't hear any whining and to make sure they're not dragging. Because with a serpentine belt, that's about the only way that's going to go bad, is whether you have a bad bearing. So now we're just going to put the ratchet back on the tensioner, loosen it up again, and put the belt back on the pulleys. Make sure you look at all the pulleys to make sure they're in the grooves correctly. So with as hot as that got, this does not have a nice clean surface to it anymore. So we're going to take some sandpaper to it and put a new piece of heat shrink over it. So now I'm just putting that main battery lead back on the alternator, connecting the pigtail. Being careful not to over tighten it, I'm just using a 1/4 inch ratchet to do this. So here's a good view of the new alternator. You'll notice this insulated extension on the main battery cable. I'm almost wondering if they were having a problem with what I had happen and they updated it. And they'll notice the pigtail is down on the side of the alternator now. So right here I'm just looking to make sure my wires aren't going to rub against my radiator hose or anything else, because eventually over time that could rub a hole in the radiator hose if it was touching it. So all that's left to do is hook the battery grounds back up on both batteries. So I'm just going to fire it up here and see what voltage I'm getting now, and we're getting 14.3 volts. At the main power at the alternator, 14.28 at the driver's side battery, and 14.28 at the passenger side as well. Here's a little better view of what happened to that old alternator. This was just a weird thing that happened. I don't know why it happened. My thoughts, if it was recent that I did the alternator, is that I would have left it loose or over tightened it. But that alternator's been on there for at least 3 years. So it's kind of hard to say what happened with this thing. So hopefully this video gave you some good information and it helped you out. If so, hit like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.